Section 58 of Marion Fay by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 15. Dismissal, B.B. By return of post, Lord Hampstead received the following answer to his letter. My dear Lord Hampstead, Mr. Crocker's case is a very bad one, but the Postmaster General shall see your appeal, and his lordship will, I am sure, sympathize with your humanity, as do I also. I cannot take upon myself to say what his lordship will think it right to do, and it will be better, therefore, that you should abstain for the present from communicating with Mr. Crocker. I am your lordship's very faithful servant, Boreas Bodkin. Any excuse was sufficient to our Aeolus to save him from the horror of dismissing a man. He knew well that Crocker, as a public servant, was not worth his salt. Sir Boreas was blessed, or cursed, with a conscience, but the stings of his conscience, though they were painful, did not hurt him so much as those of his feelings. He had owned to himself on this occasion that Crocker must go. Crocker was in every way distasteful to him. He was not only untrustworthy and incapable, but audacious also, and occasionally impudent. He was a clerk of whom he had repeatedly said that it would be much better to pay him his salary and let him have perpetual leave of absence than keep him even if there were no salary to be paid. Now there had come a case on which it was agreed by all the office that the man must go. Destroy a bundle of official papers! Mr. Jerningham had been heard to declare that the law was in fault for not having provided that a man should be at once sent to Newgate for doing such a thing. The stupid old fool's letters weren't really worth anything, Sir Boreas had said, as though attempting to palliate the crime. Mr. Jerningham had only shaken his head. What else could he do? It was not for him to dispute any matter with Sir Boreas. But to his thinking the old gentleman's letters had become precious documents, priceless records, as soon as they had once been bound by the red tape of the government, and enveloped by the security of an official pigeon-hole. To stay away without leave, to be drunk, to be obstinately idle, to be impudent, were great official sins. But Mr. Jerningham was used to them, and knew that as they had often occurred before, so would they reoccur. Clerks are mortal men, and will be idle, will be reckless, will sometimes get into disreputable rows. A little added severity, Mr. Jerningham thought, would improve his branch of the department. But knowing the nature of men, the nature especially of Sir Boreas, he could make excuses. Here, however, was a case in which no superior civil servant could entertain a doubt. And yet Sir Boreas palliated even this crime. Mr. Jerningham shook his head, and Sir Boreas shoved on one side, so as to avoid for a day the pain of thinking about them, the new bundle of papers which had already formed itself on the great Crocker case. If some one would tear up that, what a blessing it would be! In this way there was delay, during which Crocker was not allowed to show his face at the office, and during this delay Clara Demijohn became quite confirmed in her determination to throw over her engagement. Tribbledale with his £120 would be much better than Crocker with nothing. And then it was agreed generally in Paradise Row that there was something romantic in Tribbledale's constancy. Tribbledale was in the Row every day, or perhaps rather every night, seeking counsel from Mrs. Grimley, and comforting himself with hot gin and water. Mrs. Grimley was good-natured, and impartial to both the young men. She liked customers, and she liked marriages generally. "If he ain't got no income, of course he's out of the running," Mrs. Grimley said to Tribbledale, greatly comforting the young man's heart. "You go in and win," said Mrs. Grimley, indicating by that her opinion that the ardent suitor would probably be successful if he urged his love at the present moment. "Strike while the iron is hot," she said, alluding probably to the heat to which Clara's anger would be warmed by the feeling that the other lover had lost his situation just when he was most bound to be careful in maintaining it. Tribbledale went in and pleaded his case. It is probable that just at this time Clara herself was made acquainted with Tribbledale's frequent visits to the Duchess, and though she may not have been pleased with the special rendezvous selected, she was gratified by the devotion shown. When Mrs. Grimley advised Tribbledale to "go in and win," she was perhaps in Clara's confidence. When a girl has told all her friends that she is going to be married, and has already expended a considerable portion of the sum of money allowed for her wedding garments, she cannot sink back into the simple position of an unengaged young woman without pangs of conscience and qualms of remorse. Paradise Row knew that her young man was to be dismissed from his office, and condoled with her frequently and most unpleasantly. Mrs. Duffer was so unbearable in the matter that the two ladies had quarrelled dreadfully. Clara, from the first moment of her engagement with Crocker, had been proud of the second string to her bow, and now perceived that the time had come in which it might be conveniently used. It was near 11 when Tribbledale knocked at the door of No. 10, but nevertheless Clara was up, as was also the servant girl, who opened the door for the sake of discretion. "Oh, Daniel, what hours you do keep!" said Clara, when the young gentleman was shown into the parlour. "What on earth brings you here at such a time as this?" Tribbledale was never slow to declare that he was brought thither by the overwhelming ardour of his passion. His love for Clara was so old a story, and had been told so often, that the repeating of it required no circumlocution. Had he chanced to meet her in the High Street on a Sunday morning, he would have begun with it at once. "Clara," he said, "will you have me? I know that other scoundrel is a ruined man." "Oh, Daniel, you shouldn't hit those as are down." "Hasn't he been hitting me all the time that I was down? Hasn't he triumphed? Haven't you been in his arms?" "Laws, no." "And wasn't that hitting me when I was down, do you think?" "It never did you any harm." "Oh, Clara, if you knew the nature of my love, you'd understand the harm. Every time he has pressed your lips I have heard it, though I was in King's Head Court all the time." "That must be a crammer, Daniel." "I did, not with the ears of my head, but with the fibres of my breast." "Oh, ah! But, Daniel, you and Sam used to be such friends at the first go off." "Go off of what?" "When he first took to coming after me. You remember the tea party when Marion Fay was here?" "I tried it on just then. I did. I thought that maybe I might come not to care about it so much." "I'm sure you acted it very well." "And I thought that perhaps it might be the best way of touching that cold heart of yours." "Cold! I don't know as my heart is colder than anybody else's heart." "Would that you would make it warm once more for me." "Poor Sam!" said Clara, putting her handkerchief up to her eyes. "Why is he any poorer than me? I was first. At any rate I was before him." "I don't know anything about firsts or lasts," said Clara, as the ghosts of various Banquos flitted before her eyes. "And as for him, what right has he to think of any girl? He's a poor mean creature without the means of getting so much as a bed for a wife to lie on. He used to talk so proud of Her Majesty's Civil Service. Her Majesty's Civil Service has sent him away packing." Not yet, Daniel. They have. I've made it my business to find out, and Sir Boreas Bodkin has written the order to-day. Dismissal, B.B. I know those who have seen the very words written in the punishment book of the Post Office. Poor Sam. Destroying papers of the utmost importance about Her Majesty's mail service. What else was he to expect? And now he's penniless. 120 isn't so very much, Daniel. Mr. Fay was saying only the other day that if I was married and settled, they'd make it better for me. You're too fond of the Duchess, Daniel. No, Clara, no. I deny that. You ask Mrs. Grimley why it is I come to the Duchess so often. It isn't for anything that I take there. Oh, I didn't know. Young men, when they frequent those places, generally do take something. If I had a little home of my own with the girl I love on the other side of the fireplace, and perhaps a baby in her arms. Tribbledale, as he said this, looked at her with all his eyes. Laws, Daniel, what things you do say! I should never go then to any Duchess or any Marquis of Granby, or to any Angel. These were the public houses so named, all standing thick together in the neighbourhood of Paradise Row. I should not want to go anywhere then, except where that young woman and that baby were to be found. Daniel, you always was fine at poetry. Try me, if it isn't real prose. The proof of the pudding's in the eating. You come and try. By this time Clara was in his arms, and the re-engagement was as good as made. Crocker was no doubt dismissed, or if not dismissed, had shown himself to be unworthy. What could be expected of a husband who could tear up a bundle of Her Majesty's mail papers? And then Daniel Tribbledale had exhibited a romantic constancy which certainly deserved to be rewarded. Clara understood that the gin and water had been consumed night after night for her sake. And there were the lodgings, and the clock, and the harmonium ready for the occasion. I suppose it had better be so, Daniel, as you wish it so much. Wish it? I have always wished it. I wouldn't change places now with Mr. Pogson himself. He married his third wife 3 years ago. I mean in regard to the whole box and dice of it. I'd rather have my Clara with £120 than be Pogson and Littlebird with all the profits. This gratifying assurance was rewarded, and then considerably after midnight the triumphant lover took his leave. Early on the following afternoon Crocker was in Paradise Row. He had been again with Lord Hampstead, and had succeeded in worming out of the good-natured nobleman something of the information contained in the letter from Sir Boreas. The matter was to be left to the Postmaster General. Now there was an idea in the office that when a case was left to his lordship never proceeded to extremities. Kings are bound to pardon if they allow themselves to be personally concerned as to punishment. There is something of the same feeling in regard to official discipline. As a fact, the letter from Sir Boreas had been altogether false. He had known, poor man, that he must at last take the duty of deciding upon himself, and had used the name of the great chief simply as a mode of escape for the moment. But Crocker had felt that the mere statement indicated pardon. The very delay indicated pardon. Relying upon these indications, he went to Paradise Row, dressed in his best frock coat, with gloves in his hand, to declare to his love that the lodgings need not be abandoned, and that the clock and harmonium might be preserved. "But you have been dismissed," said Clara. "Never, never." "It has been written in the book. Dismissal, B.B. I know the eyes that have seen it." "That's not the way they do it at all," said Crocker, who was altogether confused. "It has been written in the book, Sam, and I know that they never go back from that.
Who wrote it? Nothing has been written. There isn't a book. Not at least like that. Tribbledale has invented it."
"Oh, Sam, why did you tear those papers? Her Majesty's mail papers! What else was there to expect? Dismissal B.B. Why did you do it? And you engaged to a young woman! No, don't come nigh to me. How was a young woman to go and get herself married to a young man, and he with nothing to support her? It isn't to be thought of. When I heard those words, dismissal B.B., I thought my very heart would sink within me."
"It's nothing of the kind," said Crocker.
"What's nothing of the kind?"
"I ain't dismissed at all."
"Oh, Sam, how dare you?"
"I tell you I ain't. He's written a letter to Lord Hampstead, who has always been my friend. Hampstead wasn't going to see me treated after that fashion. Hampstead wrote, and then Æolus wrote, that's Sir Boreas, and I've seen the letter, that is, Hampstead told me what there is in it, and I ain't to be dismissed at all. When I heard the good news, the first thing I did was to come as fast as my legs would carry me, and tell the girl of my heart."
Clara did not quite believe him, but then neither had she quite believed Tribbledale when he had announced the dismissal with a terrible corroboration of the great man's initials. But the crime committed seemed to her to be so great that she could not understand that Crocker should be allowed to remain after the perpetration of it. Crocker's salary was £150, and, balancing the two young men together, as she had often done, though she liked the poetry of Tribbledale, she did on the whole prefer the swagger and audacity of Crocker. Her Majesty's Civil Service, too, had its charms for her. The Post Office was altogether superior to Pogson and Littlebird's. Pogson and Littlebird's hours were 9 to 5. Those of Her Majesty's Service were much more genteel, 10, namely, to 4. But what might not a man do who had shown the nature of his disposition by tearing up official papers? And then, though the accidents of the occasion had enveloped her in difficulties on both sides, it seemed to her that at the present moment the lesser difficulties would be encountered by adhering to Tribbledale. She could excuse herself with Crocker. Paradise Row had already declared that the match with Crocker must be broken off. Crocker had indeed been told that the match was to be broken off. When Tribbledale had come to her overnight, she had felt herself to be a free woman. When she had given way to the voice of the charmer, when she had sunk into his arms, softened by that domestic picture which he had painted, no pricks of conscience had disturbed her happiness. Whether the dismissal B.B. had or had not yet been written, it was sure to come. She was as free to wed another as was Venice when her Doge was disposed. She could throw herself back upon the iniquity of the torn papers, were Crocker to complain. But should she now return to her Crocker, how could she excuse herself with Tribbledale? "It is all over between you and me, Sam," she said, with her handkerchief up to her eyes.
"All over? Why should it be all over?"
"You was told it was all over."
"That was when all the Row said that I was to be dismissed. There was something in it then, though perhaps a girl might have waited till a fellow had got up upon his legs again."
"Waiting ain't so pleasant, Mr. Crocker, when a girl has to look after herself."
"But I ain't dismissed at all, and there needn't be any waiting. I thought that you would be suffering as well as me, and so I came right away to you, all at once."
"So I have suffered, Sam. No one knows what I have suffered."
"But it'll all come right now?"
Clara shook her head.
"You don't mean that Tribbledale's been and talked you over already?"
"I knew Tribbledale before ever I saw you, Sam."
"How often have I heard you call him a poor mean skunk?"
"Never, Crocker, never. Such a word never passed my lips."
Something very like it, then.
I may have said he wanted spirit. I may have said so, though I disremember it. But if I did, what of that?
You despised him.
No, Crocker. What I despise is a man as goes and tears up Her Majesty's mail papers. Tribbledale never tore up anything at Pogson and Littlebird's, except what was to be tore. Tribbledale was never turned out for nigh a fortnight, so that he couldn't go and show his face in King's Head Court. Tribbledale never made hisself hated by everybody. That unknown, abominable word which Crocker had put into her mouth had roused all the woman within her, so that she was enabled to fight her battle with a courage which would not have come to her aid had he been more prudent.
Who hates me?
Mr. Jerningham does, and Roden, and Sir Boreas, and Bobbin. She had learned all their names. How can they help hating a man that tears up the mail papers? And I hate you.
Clara!
I do. What business had you to say I used that nasty word? I never do use them words. I wouldn't even so much as look at a man who'd demean himself to put such words as them into my mouth. So I tell you what it is, Mr. Crocker, you may just go away. I am going to become Daniel Tribbledale's wife, and it isn't becoming in you to stand there talking to a young woman that is engaged to another young man.
And this is to be the end of it?
If you please, Mr. Crocker.
Well.
If ever you feel inclined to speak your mind to another young woman, and you carry it as far as we did, and you wishes to hold on to her, don't you go and tear Her Majesty's mail papers. And when she tells you a bit of her mind, as I did just now, don't you go and put nasty words into her mouth. Now, if you please, you may just as well send over that clock and that harmonium to Daniel Tribbledale, Esquire, King's Head Court, Great Broad Street. So saying, she left him, and congratulated herself on having terminated the interview without much unpleasantness. Crocker, as he shook the dust off his feet upon leaving Paradise Row, began to ask himself whether he might not, upon the whole, congratulate himself as to the end to which that piece of business had been brought. When he had first resolved to offer his hand to the young lady, he had certainly imagined that that hand would not be empty. Clara was no doubt a fine girl, but not quite so young as she once was, and she had a temper of her own. Matrimony, too, was often followed by many troubles. Paradise Row would no doubt utter jeers, but he need not go there to hear them. He was not quite sure but that the tearing of the papers would in the long run be beneficial to him. End of section 58. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Section 59 of Marion Fay by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 16. Pegwell Bay. July had come and nearly gone before Lord Hampstead again saw Marion Fay. He had promised not to go to Pegwell Bay, hardly understanding why such a promise had been exacted from him, but still acceding to it when it had been suggested to him by Mrs. Roden at the request, as she said, of the Quaker. It was understood that Marion would soon return to Holloway, and that on that account the serenity of Pegwell Bay need not be disturbed by the coming of so great a man as Lord Hampstead. Hampstead had of course ridiculed the reason, but had complied with the request, with the promise, however, that Marion should return early in the summer. But the summer weeks had passed by, and Marion did not return. Letters passed between them daily, in which Marion attempted always to be cheerful. Though she had as yet invented no familiar name for her noble lover, yet she had grown into familiarity with him, and was no longer afraid of his nobility. "You oughtn't to stay there," she said, "wasting your life and doing nothing because of a sick girl. You've got your yacht, and are letting all the summer weather go by." In answer to this he wrote to her saying that he had sold his yacht. "Could you have gone with me, I would have kept it," he wrote. "Would you go with me, I would have another ready for you before you would be ready. I will make no assurance as to my future life. I cannot even guess what may become of me. It may be that I shall come to live on board some ship, so that I may be all alone. But with my heart as it is now, I cannot bear the references which others make to me about empty pleasures." At the same time he sold his horses, but he said nothing to her as to that. Gradually he did acknowledge to himself that it was her doom to die early, almost acknowledged to himself that she was dying. Nevertheless he still thought that it would have been fit that they should be married. "If I knew that she were my own, even on her deathbed," he once said to Mrs. Roden, "there would be a comfort to me in it." He was so eager in this that Mrs. Roden was almost convinced. The Quaker was willing that it should be so, but willing also that it should not be so. He would not even try to persuade his girl as to anything. It was his doom to see her go, and he, having realized that, could not bring himself to use a word in opposition to her word. But Marion herself was sternly determined against the suggestion. It was unfitting, she said, and would be wicked. It was not the meaning of marriage. She could not bring herself to disturb the last thoughts of her life, not only by the empty assumption of a grand name, but by the sounding of that name in her ears from the eager lips of those around her. "I will be your love to the end," she said, "your own Marion. But I will not be made a countess only in order that a vain name may be carved over my grave. God has provided a bitter cup for your lips, my love," she wrote again, "in having put it into your head to love one whom you must lose so soon. And mine is bitter because yours is bitter. But we cannot rid ourselves of the bitterness by pretences. Would it make your heart light to see me dressed up for a bridal ceremony, knowing as you would know that it was all for nothing? My lord, my love, let us take it as God has provided it. It is only because you grieve that I grieve, for you and my poor father. If you could only bring yourself to be reconciled, then it would be so much to me to have had you to love me in my last moments, to love me and to be loved." He could not but accept her decision. Her father and Mrs. Roden accepted it, and he was forced to do so also. He acknowledged to himself now that there was no appeal from it. Her very weakness gave her a strength which dominated him. There was an end of all his arguments and his strong phrases. He was aware that they had been of no service to him, that her soft words had been stronger than all his reasonings. But not on that account did he cease to wish that it might be as he had once wished, since he had first acknowledged to himself his love. "Of course I will not drive her," he said to Mrs. Roden, when that lady urged upon him the propriety of abstaining from a renewal of his request. "Had I any power of driving her, as you say, I would not do so. I think it would be better. That is all. Of course it must be as she shall decide." "It would be a comfort to her to think that you and she thought alike about all things," said Mrs. Roden. "There are points on which I cannot alter my convictions even for her comfort," he answered. "She bids me love some other woman. Can I comfort her by doing that? She bids me seek another wife. Can I do that, or say that I will do it at some future time? It would comfort her to know that I have no wound, that I am not lame and sick and sore and weary. It would comfort her to know that my heart is not broken. How am I to do that for her?" "No," said Mrs. Roden. "No." "There is no comfort. Her imagination paints for her some future bliss which shall not be so far away as to be made dim by distance, in enjoying which we two shall be together as we are here, with our hands free to grasp each other and our lips free to kiss. A heaven, but still a heaven of this world, in which we can hang upon each other's necks and be warm to each other's hearts. That is to be, to her, the reward of her innocence, and in the ecstasy of her faith she believes in it, as though it were here. I do think that if I told her that it should be so, that I trusted to renew my gaze upon her beauty after a few short years, then she would be happy entirely. It would be for an eternity, and without the fear of separation." "Then why not profess as she does?" "A lie? As I know her truth when she tells me her creed, so would she know my falsehood, and the lie would be vain." "Is there then to be no future world, Lord Hampstead?" "Who has said so? Certainly not I. I cannot conceive that I shall perish altogether. I do not think that if, while I am here, I can tame the selfishness of self, I shall reach a step upwards in that world which shall come next after this. As to happiness, I do not venture to think much of it. If I can only be somewhat nobler, somewhat more like the Christ whom we worship, that will be enough without happiness. If there be truth in this story, he was not happy. Why should I look for happiness, unless it be when the struggle of many worlds shall have altogether purified my spirit? But thinking like that, believing like that, how can I enter into the sweet Epicurean paradise which that child has prepared for herself?" "Is it no better than that?" "What can be better, what can be purer, if only it be true? And though it be false to me, it may be true to her. It is for my sake that she dreams of her paradise, that my wounds may be made whole, that my heart may be cured. Christ's lesson has been so learned by her that no further learning seems necessary. I fancy sometimes that I can see the platform raised just one step above the ground on which I stand, and look into the higher world to which I am ascending. It may be that it is given to her to look up the one rung of the ladder, by mounting which she shall find herself enveloped in the full glory of perfection." In conversations such as these, Mrs. Roden was confounded by the depth of the man's love. It became impossible to bid him not to be of a broken heart, or even to allude to those fresh hopes which time would bring. He spoke to her often of his future life, always speaking of a life from which Marion would have been withdrawn by death, and did so with a cold, passionless assurance which showed her that he had almost resolved as to the future. He would see all lands that were to be seen, and converse with all people. The social condition of God's creatures at large should be his study. The task would be endless, and, as he said, an endless task hardly admits of absolute misery. "If I die, there will be an end of it. If I live till old age shall have made me powerless to carry on my work, time will then probably have done something to dim the feeling. I think," he said again, "I feel that, could I but remember her as my wife—" "It is impossible," said Mrs. Roden. "But if it were so! It would be no more than a thin, threadbare cloak over a woman's shivering shoulders. It is not much against the cold, but it would be very cruel to take that little from her." She looked at him with her eyes flooded with tears, but she could only shake her head in sign that it was impossible. At last, just at the end of July, there came a request that he would go down to Pegwell Bay. "It is so long since we have seen each other," she wrote, "and perhaps it is better that you should come than that I should go. The doctor is fidgety and says so. But my darling will be good to me, will he not? When I have seen a tear in your eyes, it has gone near to crush me. That a woman or even a man should weep at some unexpected tidings of woe is natural. But who cries for spilt milk? Tell me that God's hand, though it be heavy to you, shall be borne with reverence and obedience and love. He did not tell her this, but he resolved that if possible she should see no tears. As for that cheerfulness, that reconciliation to his fate which she desired, he knew it to be impossible. He almost brought himself to believe as he travelled down to Pegwell Bay that it would be better that they should not meet. To thank the Lord for all his mercies was in her mind. To complain with all the bitterness of his heart of the cruelty with which he was treated was in his. He had told Mrs. Roden that, according to his creed, there would be a better world to come for him if he could succeed in taming the selfishness of self. But he told himself now that the struggle to do so had hitherto been vain. There had been but the one thing which had ever been to him supremely desirable. He had gone through the years of his early life forming some utopian ideas, dreaming of some perfection in politics, in philanthropy, in social reform, and the like, something by devoting himself to which he could make his life a joy to himself. Then this girl had come across him, and there had suddenly sprung up within him a love so strong that all these other things faded into littlenesses. They should not be discarded. Work would be wanted for his life, and for hers. But here he had found the true salt by which all his work would be vivified and preserved, and made holy and happy and glorious. There had come a something to him that was all that he wanted it to be. And now the something was fading from him, was already all but gone. In such a state how should he tame the selfishness of self? He abandoned the attempt, and told himself that difficulties had been prepared for him greater than any of which he had dreamed, when he had hoped that the taming might be within his power. He could not even spare her in his selfishness. He declared to himself that it was so, and almost owned that it would be better that he should not go to her. "Yes," she said, when he sat down beside her on her sofa at an open window looking out on the little bay. "Put your hand on mine, dear, and leave it there. To have you with me, to feel the little breeze, and to see you and to touch you, is absolute happiness." "Why did you so often tell me not to come?" "Ah, why? But I know why it was, my lord." There was something half of tenderness, half pleasantry in the mode of address, and now he had ceased to rebel against it. "Why should I not come if it be a joy to you?" "You must not be angry now." "Certainly not angry." "We have got through all that, you and I have for ourselves. But there is a sort of unseemliness in your coming down here to see a poor Quaker's daughter." "Marion!" "But there is. We had got through all that in Paradise Row. Paradise Row had become used to you, and I could bear it. But here they will all be sure to know who you are." "Who cares?" "That Marion Fay should have a lover would of itself make a stir in this little place. But that she should have a lord for her lover! One doesn't want to be looked at as a miracle." "The follies of others should not ruffle you and me." "That's very well, dear. But what if one is ruffled? But I won't be ruffled, and you shall come. When I thought that I should again go to our own house, then I thought we might perhaps dispense with the ruffling. That was all." There was a something in these words which he could not stand, which he could not bear, and repressed that tear which, as she had said, would go near to crush her if she saw it. Had she not plainly intimated her conviction that she would never again return to her old home? Here, here, in this very spot, the doom was to come, and to come quickly. He got up and walked across the room, and stood a little behind her where she could not see his face. "Do not leave me," she said. "I told you to stay and let your hand rest on mine." Then he returned, and laying his hand once again upon her lap, turned his face away from her. "Bear it," she said. "Bear it." His hand quivered where it lay as he shook his head. "Call upon your courage and bear it." "I cannot bear it," he said, rising suddenly from his chair and hurrying out of the room. He went out of the room and from the house on to the little terrace which ran in front of the sea. But his escape was of no use to him. He could not leave her. He had come out without his hat, and he could not stand there in the sun to be stared at. "I am a coward," he said, going back to her and resuming his chair. "I own it. Let there be no more said about it. When a trouble comes to me, it conquers me. Little troubles I think I could bear. If it had been all else in the world, if it had been my life before my life was your life, I think that no one would have seen me blench. But now I find that when I am really tried, I fail." "It is in God's hands, dearest." "Yes, it is in God's hands. There is some power, no doubt, that makes you strong in spirit but frail in body, while I am strong to live but weak of heart. But how will that help me?" "Oh, Lord Hampstead, I do so wish you had never seen me." "You should not say that, Marion. You shall not think it. I am ungrateful, because were it given to me to have it all back again, I would not sell what I have had of you, though the possession has been so limited, for all other imaginable treasures. I will bear it. Oh, my love, I will bear it. Do not say again that you wish you had not seen me." "For myself, dear, for myself." "Do not say it for me. I will struggle to make a joy of it, a joy in some degree, though my heart bleeds at the widowhood that is coming on it. I will build up for myself a memory in which there shall be much to satisfy me. I shall have been loved by her to have possessed whose love has been and shall be a glory to me." "Loved indeed, my darling." "Though there might have been such a heaven of joy, even that shall be counted as much. It shall be to me during my future life as though, when wandering through the green fields in some long past day, I had met a bright angel from another world, and the angel had stopped to speak to me, and had surrounded me with her glorious wings, and had given me of her heavenly light, and had spoken to me with the music of the spheres, and I had thought that she would stay with me for ever. But there had come a noise of the drums and a sound of the trumpets, and she had flown away from me up to her own abode. To have been so favoured, though it had been but for an hour, should suffice for a man's life. I will bear it, though it be in solitude." "No, darling, not in solitude." "It will be best so for me. The light and the music and the azure of the wings will so remain with me the purer and the brighter. Oh, if it had been! But I will bear it. No ear shall again hear a sound of complaint. Not yours even, my darling, my own. Mine for so short a time, but yet my very own, for ever and ever." Then he fell on his knees beside her and hid his face in her dress while the fingers of both her hands rambled through his hair. "You are going," he said, when he rose up to his feet. "You are going whither I cannot go." "You will come to me." "You are going now, soon, and I doubt not that you are going to joys inexpressible. I cannot go till some chance may take me. If it be given to you in that further world to see those and to think of those whom you have left below, then, if my heart be true to your heart, keep your heart true to mine. If I can fancy that, If I can believe that it is so, then shall I have that angel with me. And though my eyes may not see the tints, my ears will hear the music. And though the glory be not palpable as is the light of heaven, there will be an inner glory in which my soul will be sanctified. After that there were not many words spoken between them, though he remained there till he was disturbed by the Quaker's coming. Part of the time she slept with her hand in his, and when awake she was contented to feel his touch as he folded the scarf close round her neck and straightened the shawl which lay across her feet, and now and again stroked her hair and put it back behind her ears as it strayed upon her forehead. Ever and again she would murmur a word or two of love as she revelled in the perception of his solicitude. What was there for her to regret, for her to whom was given the luxury of such love? Was not a month of it more than a whole life without it? Then, when the father came, Hampstead took his leave. As he kissed her lips, something seemed to tell him that it would be for the last time. It was not good, the Quaker had said, that she should be disturbed. Yes, he would come again, but not quite yet. At the very moment when the Quaker so spoke, she was pressing her lips to his. "God keep you and take you, my darling," she whispered to him, "and bring you to me in heaven." She noticed not at all at the moment the warm tears that were running on to her own face, nor did the Quaker seem to notice it when Lord Hampstead left the house without saying to him a word of farewell. End of section 59. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Section 60 of Marion Fay by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 17, Lady Amaldina's Wedding. The time came round for Lady Amaldina's marriage, than which nothing more august, nothing more aristocratic, nothing more truly savouring of the hymeneal altar had ever been known or was ever to be known in the neighbourhood of Hanover Square. For it was at last decided that the marriage should take place in London before any of the aristocratic assistants at the ceremony should have been whirled away into autumnal spaces. Lord Llwddythlw himself knew but very little about it, except this, that nothing would induce him so to hurry on the ceremony as to interfere with his parliamentary duties. A day in August had been mentioned in special reference to Parliament. He was willing to abide by that, or to go to the sacrifice at any earlier day of which Parliament would admit. Parliament was to sit for the last time on Wednesday, 12th August, and the marriage was fixed for the 13th. Lady Amaldina had prayed for the concession of a week. Readers will not imagine that she based her prayers on the impatience of love. Nor could a week be of much significance in reference to that protracted and dangerous delay to which the match had certainly been subjected. But the bevy might escape. How were 20 young ladies to be kept together in the month of August, when all the young men were rushing off to Scotland? Others were not wedded to their duties as was Lord Llwddythlw. Lady Amaldina knew well how completely Parliament became a mere affair of governmental necessities during the first weeks of August. "I should have thought that just on this one occasion you might have managed it," she said to him, trying to mingle a tone of love with the sarcasm which, at such a crisis, was natural to her. He simply reminded her of the promise which he had made to her in the spring. He thought it best not to break through arrangements which had been fixed. When she told him of one very slippery member of the bevy, slippery not as to character but in reference to the movements of her family, He suggested that no one would know the difference if only 19 were to be clustered round the bride's train. "Don't you know that they must be in pairs?" "Will not 9 pairs suffice?" he asked. "And thus make one of them an enemy for ever by telling her that I wish to dispense with her services?" But it was of no use. "Dispense with them altogether," he said, looking her full in the face. "The 20 will not quarrel with you. My object is to marry you, and I don't care 2d. for the bridesmaids." There was something so near to a compliment in this that she was obliged to accept it. And she had, too, begun to perceive that Lord Llwddythlw was a man not easily made to change his mind. She was quite prepared for this in reference to her future life. A woman, she thought, might be saved much trouble by having a husband whom she was bound to obey. But in this matter of her marriage ceremony, this last affair in which she might be presumed to act as a free woman, she did think it hard that she might not be allowed to have her own way. The bridegroom, however, was firm. If Thursday the 13th did not suit her, he would be quite ready on Thursday the 20th. "There wouldn't be one of them left in London," said Lady Amaldina. "What on earth do you think that they are to do with themselves?" But all the bevy were true to her. Lady Amelia Beaudesert was a difficulty. Her mother insisted on going to a far-away Bavarian lake on which she had a villa. But Lady Amelia at the last moment surrendered the villa rather than break up the bevy, and consented to remain with a grumpy old aunt in Essex till an opportunity should offer. It may be presumed, therefore, that it was taken to be a great thing to be one of the bevy. It is no doubt a pleasant thing for a girl to have it asserted in all the newspapers that she is by acknowledgment one of the 20 most beautiful unmarried ladies in Great Britain. Lady Frances was of course one of the bevy, but there was a member of the family, a connection rather, whom no eloquence could induce to show himself either in the church or at the breakfast. This was Lord Hampstead. His sister came to him and assured him that he ought to be there. "Sorrows," she said, "that have declared themselves before the world are held as a sufficient excuse, but a man should not be hindered from his duties by a secret grief." "I make no secret of it. I do not talk about my private affairs. I do not send a town crier to Charing Cross to tell the passers-by that I am in trouble. But I care not whether men know or not that I am unfitted for joining in such festivities. My presence is not wanted for their marriage." "It will be odd." "Let it be odd. I most certainly shall not be there." But he remembered the occasion, and showed that he did so by sending to the bride the handsomest of all the gems which graced her exhibition of presents, short of the tremendous set of diamonds which had come from the Duke of Merioneth. This collection was supposed to be the most gorgeous thing that had ever as yet been arranged in London. It would certainly not be too much to say that the wealth of precious toys brought together would, if sold at its cost price, have made an ample fortune for a young newly married couple. The families were noble and wealthy, and the richness of the wedding presents was natural. It might perhaps have been better had not the value of the whole been stated in one of the newspapers of the day. Who was responsible for the valuation was never known, but it seemed to indicate that the costliness of the gifts was more thought of than the affection of the givers. And it was undoubtedly true that, in high circles and among the clubs, the cost of the collection was much discussed. The diamonds were known to a stone, and Hampstead's rubies were spoken of almost as freely as though they were being exhibited in public. Lord Llwddythlw, when he heard of all this, muttered to his maiden sister a wish that a gnome would come in the night and run away with everything. He felt himself degraded by the publicity given to his future wife's ornaments. But the gnome did not come, and the young men from Messrs. Bijou and Carcanet were allowed to arrange the tables and shelves for the exhibition. The breakfast was to take place at the Foreign Office, at which the bride's father was for the time being the chief occupant. Lord Persiflage had not at first been willing that it should be so, thinking that his own more modest house might suffice for the marriage of his own daughter. But grander counsels had been allowed to prevail. With whom the idea first arose Lord Persiflage never knew. It might probably have been with some of the bevy, who had felt that an ordinary drawing room would hardly suffice for so magnificent an array of toilettes. Perhaps the thought had first occurred to Messrs. Bijou and Carcanet, who had foreseen the glory of spreading out all that wealth in the magnificent saloon intended for the welcoming of ambassadors. But it travelled from Lady Amaldina to her mother, and was passed on from Lady Persiflage to her husband. "Of course the ambassadors will all be there," the Countess had said, "and therefore it will be a public occasion." "I wish we could be married at Llanfihangel," Lord Llwddythlw said to his bride. Now Llanfihangel Church was a very small edifice with a thatched roof among the mountains in North Wales, with which Lady Amaldina had been made acquainted when visiting the Duchess, her future mother-in-law. But Llwddythlw was not to have his way in everything, and the preparations at the Foreign Office were continued. The beautifully embossed invitations were sent about among a large circle of noble and aristocratic friends. All the ambassadors and all the ministers, with all their wives and daughters, were of course asked. As the breakfast was to be given in the great banqueting hall at the Foreign Office, it was necessary that the guests should be many. It is sometimes well in a matter of festivals to be saved from extravagance by the modest size of one's rooms. Lord Persiflage told his wife that his own daughter's marriage would ruin him. In answer to this she reminded him that Llwddythlw had asked for no fortune. Lord Llwddythlw was one of those men who prefer giving to taking. He had a feeling that a husband should supply all that was wanted, and that a wife should owe everything to the man she marries. The feeling is uncommon just at present, except with the millions who neither have nor expect other money than what they earn. If you are told that the daughter of an old man who has earned his own bread is about to marry a young man in the same condition of life, it is spoken of as a misfortune. But Lord Llwddythlw was old-fashioned, and had the means of acting in accordance with his prejudices. Let the marriage be ever so gorgeous, it would not cost the dowry which an earl's daughter might have expected. That was the argument used by Lady Persiflage, and it seemed to have been effectual. As the day drew near it was observed that the bridegroom became more sombre and silent even than usual. He never left the House of Commons as long as it was open to him as a refuge. His Saturdays and his Sundays and his Wednesdays he filled up with work so various and unceasing that there was no time left for those pretty little attentions which a girl about to be married naturally expects. He did call, perhaps every other day, at his bride's house, but never remained there above 2 minutes. "I am afraid he is not happy," the Countess said to her daughter. "Oh yes, mamma, he is." "Then why does he go on like that?" "Oh, mamma, you do not know him." "Do you?" "I think so. My belief is that there isn't a man in London so anxious to be married as Llwddythlw." "I am glad of that." "He has lost so much time that he knows it ought to be got through and done with without further delay. If he could only go to sleep and wake up a married man of 3 months' standing, he would be quite happy. If it could be administered under chloroform it would be so much better. It is the doing of the thing, and the being talked about and looked at, that is so odious to him." "Then why not have had it done quietly, my dear?" "Because there are follies, mamma, to which a woman should never give way. I will not have myself made humdrum. If I had been going to marry a handsome young man, so as to have a spice of romance out of it all, I would have cared nothing about the bridesmaids and the presents. The man then would have stood for everything. Llwddythlw is not young and is not handsome." "But he is thoroughly noble." "Quite so. He is as good as gold. He will always be somebody in people's eyes because he's great and grand and trustworthy all round. But I want to be somebody in people's eyes too, mamma. I'm all very well to look at, but nothing particular. I'm papa's daughter, which is something, but not enough. I mean to begin and be magnificent. He understands it all, and I don't think he'll oppose me when once this exhibition day is over. I've thought all about it, and I think that I know what I'm doing." At any rate, she had her way, and thoroughly enjoyed the task she had on hand. When she had talked of a possible romance with a handsome young lover, she had not quite known herself. She might have made the attempt, but it would have been a failure. She could fall in love with a Master of Ravenswood in a novel, but would have given herself by preference, after due consideration, to the richer though less poetical suitor. Of good sterling gifts she did know the value, and was therefore contented with her lot. But this business of being married, with all the most extravagant appurtenances of the hymeneal altar, was to her taste. That picture in one of the illustrated papers which professed to give the hymeneal altar at St. George's, with the Bishop and the Dean and the two Queen's chaplains officiating, and the bride and the bridegroom in all their glory, with a royal Duke and a royal Duchess looking on, with all the stars and all the garters from our own and other courts, and especially with the bevy of 20 standing in 10 distinct pairs, and each from a portrait, was manifestly a work of the imagination. I was there, and to tell the truth it was rather a huddled matter. The spaces did not seem to admit of majestic grouping, and as 3 of these chief personages had the gout, the sticks of these lame gentlemen were to my eyes very conspicuous. The bevy had not room enough, and the ladies in the crush seemed to feel the intense heat. Something had made the Bishop cross. I am told that Lady Amaldina had determined not to be hurried, while the Bishop was due at an afternoon meeting at 3. The artist, in creating the special work of art, had soared boldly into the ideal. In depicting the buffet of presents and the bridal feast, he may probably have been more accurate. I was not myself present. The youthful appearance of the bridegroom as he rose to make his speech may probably be attributed to a poetic license, permissible, nay audible, nay necessary on such an occasion. The buffet of presents no doubt was all there, though it may be doubted whether the contributions from royalty were in truth so conspicuous as they were made to appear. There were speeches spoken by 2 or 3 foreign ministers, and one by the bride's father, but the speech which has created most remark was from the bridegroom. "I hope we may be as happy as your kind wishes would have us," said he, and then he sat down. It was declared afterwards that these were the only words which passed his lips on the occasion. To those who congratulated him he merely gave his hand and bowed, and yet he looked to be neither fluttered nor ill at ease. We know how a brave man will sit and have his tooth taken out without a sign of pain on his brow, trusting to the relief which is to come to him. So it was with Lord Llwddythlw. It might perhaps have saved pain if, as Lady Amaldina had said, chloroform could have been used. "Well, my dear, it is done at last," Lady Persiflage said to her daughter when the bride was taken into some chamber for the readjustment of her dress. "Yes, mamma, it is done now." "And are you happy?" "Certainly I am. I have got what I wanted." "And you can love him?" Coming from Lady Persiflage, this did seem to be romantic; but she had been stirred up to some serious thoughts as she remembered that she was now surrendering to a husband the girl whom she had made, whom she had tutored, whom she had prepared either for the good or for the evil performance of the duties of life. "Oh yes, mamma," said Lady Amaldina. It is so often the case that the pupils are able to exceed the teaching of their tutors. It was so in this case. The mother, as she saw her girl given up to a silent, middle-aged, unattractive man, had her misgivings, but not so the daughter herself. She had looked at it all around, and had resolved that she could do her duty, under certain stipulations which she thought would be accorded to her. "He has more to say for himself than you think, only he won't trouble himself to make assertions. And if he is not very much in love, he likes me better than anybody else, which goes a long way." Her mother blessed her and led her away into a room where she joined her husband in order that she might then be taken down to the carriage. The bride herself had not quite understood what was to take place, and was surprised to find herself quite alone for a moment with her husband. "My wife," he said, "now kiss me." She ran into his arms and put up her face to him. "I thought you were going to forget that," she said, as he held her for a moment with his arm round her waist. "I could not dare," he said, "to handle all that gorgeous drapery of lace. You were dressed up then for an exhibition. You look now as my wife ought to look." "It had to be done, Llwddythlw." "I make no complaint, dearest. I only say that I like you better as you are, as a girl to kiss and to embrace and to talk to, and to make my own." Then she curtsied to him prettily and kissed him again, and after that they walked out arm in arm down to the carriage. There were many carriages drawn up within the quadrangle of which the Foreign Office forms a part, but the carriage which was to take the bride and the bridegroom away was allowed a door to itself, at any rate till such time as they should have been taken away. An effort had been made to keep the public out of the quadrangle, but as the duties of the 4 Secretaries of State could not be suspended, and as the great gates are supposed to make a public thoroughfare, this could only be done to a certain extent. The crowd, no doubt, was thicker out in Downing Street, but there were very many standing within the square. Among these there was one, beautifully arrayed in frock coat and yellow gloves, almost as though he himself was prepared for his own wedding. When Lord Llwddythlw brought Lady Amaldina out from the building and handed her into the carriage, and when the husband and wife had seated themselves, the well-dressed individual raised his hat from his head and greeted them.
"Long life and happiness to the bride of Castle Hautboy," said he at the top of his voice.
Lady Amaldina could not but see the man, and recognizing him, she bowed. It was Crocker, the irrepressible Crocker. He had been also in the church. The narrator and he had managed to find standing room in a back pew under one of the galleries. Now would he be able to say with perfect truth that he had been at the wedding, and had received a parting salute from the bride, whom he had known through so many years of her infancy? He probably did believe that he was entitled to count the future Duchess of Merioneth among his intimate friends. End of section 60. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Section 61 of Marion Fay by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 13. Crocker's Tale. A thing difficult to get is the thing mostly prized, not the thing that is valuable. 2 or 3 additional Kimberley mines found somewhere among the otherwise uninteresting plains of South Africa would bring down the price of diamonds amazingly. It could hardly have been the beauty or the wit or the accomplishments of Clara Demijohn which caused Mr. Tribbledale to triumph so loudly and with so genuine an exultation, telling all Broad Street of his success when he had succeeded in winning the bride who had once promised herself to Crocker. Were it not that she had all but slipped through his fingers, he would never surely have thought her to be worthy of such a pæan. Had she come to his first whistle, he might have been contented enough, as are other ordinary young men with their ordinary young women. He would probably have risen to no enthusiasm of passion. But as things had gone, he was as another Paris who had torn a Helen from her Menelaus, only in this case an honest Paris with a correct Helen, and from a Menelaus who had not as yet made good his claim. But the subject was worthy of another Iliad, to be followed by another Æneid. By his bow and his spear he had torn her from the arms of a usurping lover, and now made her all his own. Another man would have fainted and abandoned the contest when rejected as he had been. But he had continued the fight, even when lying low on the dust of the arena. He had nailed his flag to the mast when all his rigging had been cut away, and at last he had won the battle. Of course his Clara was doubly dear to him, having been made his own after such difficulties as these. "I'm not one of those who easily give way in an affair of the heart," he said to Mr. Littlebird, the junior partner in the firm, when he told that gentleman of his engagement. "So I perceive, Mr. Tribbledale." "When a man has set his affection on a young lady, that is, his real affection, he ought to stick to it or die." Mr. Littlebird, who was the happy father of 3 or 4 married and marriageable daughters, opened his eyes with surprise. The young men who had come after his young ladies had been pressing enough, but they had not died. "Or die," repeated Tribbledale. "It is what I should have done. Had she become Mrs. Crocker, I should never again have been seen in the court." The court was the little alley in which Pogson and Littlebird's office was held. "Unless they had brought my dead body here to be identified." He was quite successful in his enthusiasm. Though Mr. Littlebird laughed when he told the story to Mr. Pogson, not the less did they agree to raise his salary to £160 on and from the day of his marriage. "Yes, Mr. Fay," he said to the poor old Quaker, who had lately been so broken by his sorrow as hardly to be as much master of Tribbledale as he used to be, "I have no doubt I shall be steady now. If anything can make a young man steady, it is success in love." "I hope thou wilt be happy, Mr. Tribbledale." "I shall be happy enough now. My heart will be more in the business. What there isn't of it at any rate with that dear creature in our mutual home at Islington. It was lucky about his having taken those lodgings, because Clara had got, as it were, used to them. And there are 1 or 2 things, such as a clock and the like, which need not be moved. If anything ever should happen to you, Mr. Fay, Pogson and Littlebird will find me quite up to the business." "Something will happen some day, no doubt," said the Quaker. On one occasion Lord Hampstead was in the court, having a word to say to Marion's father, or perhaps a word to hear. "I'm sure you'll excuse me, my lord," said Tribbledale, following him out of the office. "Oh yes," said Hampstead, with a smile, for he had been there often enough to have made some acquaintance with the junior clerk. "If there be anything I can do for you, I will do it willingly." "Only just to congratulate me, my lord. You have heard of Crocker?" Lord Hampstead owned that he had heard of Crocker. "He has been interfering with me in the tenderest of parts." Lord Hampstead looked serious. There is a young woman." The poor victim frowned, he knew not why, but remitted his frown and smiled again. "Who had promised herself to me? Then that rude assailant came and upset all my joy." Here, as the narrator paused, Lord Hampstead owned to himself that he could not deny the truth of the description. "Perhaps," continued Tribbledale, "perhaps you have seen Clara Demijohn?" Lord Hampstead could not remember having been so fortunate. "Because I am aware that your steps have wandered in the way of Paradise Row." Then there came the frown again, and then the smile. "Well, perhaps it may be that a more perfect form of feminine beauty may be ascribed to another." This was intended as a compliment, more civil than true, paid to Marion Fay on Lord Hampstead's behalf. "But for a combination of chastity and tenderness, I don't think you can easily beat Clara Demijohn." Lord Hampstead bowed, as showing his readiness to believe such a statement coming from so good a judge. For a while the interloper prevailed. Interlopers do prevail, such is the female heart. But the true rock shows itself always at last. She is the true rock on which I have built the castle of my happiness. "Then I congratulate you, Mr. Tribbledale." "Yes; and not only that, my lord, but Crocker is nowhere. You must own that there is a triumph in that. There was a time, oh, how I felt it! There was a time when he triumphed, when he talked of my Clara as though I hadn't a chance. He's up a tree now, my lord. I thought I'd just tell you as you are so friendly, coming among us here, my lord." Lord Hampstead again congratulated him, and expressed a hope that he might be allowed to send the bride a small present. "Oh, my lord," said Tribbledale, "it shall go with the clock and the harmonium, and shall be the proudest moment of my life." When Miss Demijohn heard that the salary of Pogson and Littlebird's clerk, she called it Dan's screw in speaking of the matter to her aunt, had been raised to £160 per annum, she felt that there could be no excuse for a further change. Up to that moment it had seemed to her that Tribbledale had obtained his triumph by a deceit which it still might be her duty to frustrate. He had declared positively that those fatal words had been actually written in the book, "Dismissal B.B." But she had learned that the words had not been written as yet. All is fair in love and war. She was not in the least angry with Tribbledale because of his little ruse. A lie told in such a cause was a merit. But not on that account need she be led away by it from her own most advantageous course. In spite of the little quarrel which had sprung up between herself and Crocker, Crocker still belonging to Her Majesty's Civil Service, must be better than Tribbledale. But when she found that Tribbledale's statement as to the £160 was true, and when she bethought herself that Crocker would probably be dismissed sooner or later, then she determined to be firm. As to the £160, old Mrs. Demijohn herself went to the office and learned the truth from Zachary Fay. "I think he is a good young man," said the Quaker, "and he will do very well if he will cease to think quite so much of himself." To this Mrs. Demijohn remarked that half a dozen babies might probably cure that fault. So the matter was settled, and it came to pass that Daniel Tribbledale and Clara Demijohn were married at Holloway on that very Thursday which saw completed the alliance which had been so long arranged between the noble houses of Powell and de Hauteville. There were 2 letters written on the occasion, which shall be given here as showing the willingness to forget and forgive which marked the characters of the 2 persons. A day or 2 before the marriage the following invitation was sent: "Dear Sam, I hope you will quite forget what is past, at any rate what was unpleasant, and come to our wedding on Thursday. There is to be a little breakfast here afterwards, and I am sure that Dan will be very happy to shake your hand. I have asked him, and he says that as he is to be the bridegroom, he would be proud to have you as best man. Your old sincere friend, Clara Demijohn, for the present. The answer was as follows: Dear Clara, there is no malice in me. Since our little tiff I have been thinking that, after all, I'm not the man for matrimony. To sip the honey from many flowers is, perhaps, after all, my line of life. I should have been happy to be Dan Tribbledale's bottle holder, but that there is another affair coming off which I must attend. Our Lady Amaldina is to be married, and I must be there. Our families have been connected, as you know, for a great many years, and I could not forgive myself if I did not see her turned off. No other consideration would have prevented me from accepting your very kind invitation. Your loving old friend, Sam Crocker. There did come a pang of regret across Clara's heart as she read this, as to the connection of the families. Of course Crocker was lying. Of course it was an empty boast. But there was a savour of aristocracy even in the capability of telling such a lie. Had she made Crocker her husband, she also would have been able to drag Castle Hautboy into her daily conversations with Mrs. Duffer. At the time of these weddings, the month of August, Æolus had not even yet come to a positive and actual decision as to Crocker's fate. Crocker had been suspended, by which act he had been temporarily expelled from the office, so that his time was all his own to do what he pleased with. Whether when suspended he would receive his salary, no one knew as a certainty. The presumption was that a man suspended would be dismissed, unless he could succeed in explaining away or diminishing the scene of which he had been supposed to be guilty. Æolus himself could suspend, but it required an act on the part of the senior official to dismiss, or even to deprive the sinner of any part of his official emoluments. There had been no explanation possible. No diminishing of the sin had been attempted. It was acknowledged on all sides that Crocker had, as Miss Demijohn properly described it, destroyed Her Majesty's mail papers. In order that unpardonable delay and idleness might not be traced home to him, he had torn into fragments a bundle of official documents. His character was so well known that no one doubted his dismissal. Mr. Jerningham had spoken of it as a thing accomplished. Bobbin and Geraghty had been congratulated on their rise in the department. Dismissal B.B. had been recorded, if not in any official book, at any rate in all official minds. But B.B. himself had as yet decided nothing. When Crocker attended Lady Amaldina's wedding in his best coat and gloves, he was still under suspension, but trusting to the conviction that after so long a reprieve capital punishment would not be carried out. Sir Boreas Bodkin had shoved the papers on one side, and since that nothing further had been said on the matter. Weeks had passed, but no decision had been made public. Sir Boreas was a man whom the subordinates nearest to him did not like to remind as to any such duty as this. When a case was shoved on one side, it was known to be something unpalatable. And yet, as Mr. Jerningham whispered to George Roden, it was a thing that ought to be settled. "He can't come back, you know," he said. "I dare say he will," said the Duca. "Impossible. I look upon it as impossible." This Mr. Jerningham said very seriously. "There are some people, you know," rejoined the other, "whose bark is so much worse than their bite." "I know there are, Mr. Roden, and Sir Boreas is perhaps one of them. But there are cases in which to pardon the thing done seems to be perfectly impossible. This is one of them. If papers are to be destroyed with impunity, what is to become of the department? I, for one, should not know how to go on with my duties. Tearing up papers! Good heavens! When I think of it, I doubt whether I am standing on my head or my heels." This was very strong language for Mr. Jerningham, who was not accustomed to find fault with the proceedings of his superiors. He went about the office all these weeks with a visage of woe and the air of a man conscious that some great evil was at hand. Sir Boreas had observed it, and knew well why that visage was so long. Nevertheless, when his eyes fell on that bundle of papers, on the Crocker bundle of papers, he only pushed it a little further out of sight than it was before. Who does not know how odious a letter will become by being shoved on one side day after day? Answer it at the moment, and it will be nothing. Put it away unread, or at least undigested, for a day, and it at once begins to assume ugly proportions. When you have been weak enough to let it lie on your desk, or worse again, hidden in your breast pocket, for a week or 10 days, it will have become an enemy so strong and so odious that you will not dare to attack it. It throws a gloom over all your joys. It makes you cross to your wife, severe to the cook, and critical to your own wine cellar. It becomes the black care which sits behind you when you go out a-riding. You have neglected a duty, and have put yourself in the power of perhaps some vulgar snarler. You think of destroying it, and denying it, dishonestly and falsely, as Crocker did the mail papers. And yet you must bear yourself all the time as though there were no load lying near your heart. So it was with our Æolus and the Crocker papers. The papers had become a great bundle. The unfortunate man had been called upon for an explanation, and had written a blundering long letter on a huge sheet of foolscap paper, which Sir Boreas had not read and did not mean to read. Large fragments of the torn mail papers had been found, and were all there. Mr. Jerningham had written a well-worded, lengthy report, which never certainly would be read. There were former documents in which the existence of the papers had been denied. Altogether the bundle was big and unholy and distasteful. Those who knew our Æolus well were sure that he would never even undo the tape by which the bundle was tied. But something must be done. 1 month's pay day had already passed since the suspension, and the next was at hand. "Can anything be settled about Mr. Crocker?" asked Mr. Jerningham one day about the end of August. Sir Boreas had already sent his family to a little place he had in the west of Ireland, and was postponing his holiday because of this horrid matter. Mr. Jerningham could never go away till Æolus went. Sir Boreas knew all this, and was thoroughly ashamed of himself. "Just speak to me about it to morrow, and we'll settle the matter," he said, in his blandest voice. Mr. Jerningham retreated from the room frowning. According to his thinking, there ought to be nothing to settle. "Damn the fellow!" said Sir Boreas, as soon as the door was closed, and he gave the papers another shove which sent them off the huge table on to the floor. Whether it was Mr. Jerningham or Crocker who was damned, he hardly knew himself. Then he was forced to stoop to the humility of picking up the bundle. That afternoon he roused himself. About 3 o'clock he sent, not for Mr. Jerningham, but for the Duca. When Roden entered the room, the bundle was before him, but not opened. "Can you send for this man and get him here to day?" he asked. The Duca promised that he would do his best. "I can't bring myself to recommend his dismissal," he said. The Duca only smiled. "The poor fellow is just going to be married, you know." The Duca smiled again. Living in Paradise Row himself, he knew that the lady, née Clara Demijohn, was already the happy wife of Mr. Tribbledale. But he knew also that after so long an interval Crocker could not well be dismissed, and he was not ill-natured enough to rob his chief of so good an excuse. He left the room, therefore, declaring that he would cause Crocker to be summoned immediately. Crocker was summoned and came. Had Sir Boreas made up his mind briefly to dismiss the man or briefly to forgive him, the interview would have been unnecessary. As things now were, the man could not certainly be dismissed. Sir Boreas was aware of that, nor could he be pardoned without further notice. Crocker entered the room with that mingling of the bully and the coward in his appearance which is generally the result when a man who is overawed attempts to show that he is not afraid. Sir Boreas passed his fingers through the hairs on each side of his head, frowned hard, and blowing through his nostrils became at once the Æolus that he had been named. Assumes the god, affects to nod, and seems to shake the spheres. "Mr. Crocker," said the god, laying his hand on the bundle of papers still tied up in a lump. Then he paused and blew the wrath out of his nostrils.
"Sir Boreas, no one can be more sorry for an accident than I am for that."
"An accident?"
"Well, Sir Boreas, I am afraid I shall not make you understand it all."
"I don't think you will."
"The first paper I did tear up by accident, thinking it was something done with."
"Then you thought you might as well send the others after it?"
"One or two were torn by accident. Then—"
"Well?"
"I hope you'll overlook it this time, Sir Boreas."
"I have done nothing but look it over, as you call it, since you came into the department. You've been a disgrace to the office. You're of no use whatever. You give more trouble than all the other clerks put together. I'm sick of hearing your name."
"If you'll try me again, I'll turn over a new leaf, Sir Boreas."
"I don't believe it for a moment. They tell me you're just going to be married." Crocker was silent. Could he be expected to cut the ground from under his own feet at such a moment? "For the young lady's sake I don't like turning you adrift on the world at such a time. I only wish that she had a more secure basis for her happiness."
"She'll be all right," said
Crocker. "He will probably be thought to have been justified in carrying on the delusion at such a crisis of his life." "But you must take my assurance of this," said Æolus, looking more like the god of storms, "that no wife or baby, no joy or trouble, shall save you again, if you again deserve dismissal." Crocker, with his most affable smile, thanked Sir Boreas, and withdrew. It was said afterwards that Sir Boreas had seen and read that smile on Roden's face, had put two and two together in regard to him, and had become sure that there was to be no marriage. But had he lost that excuse, where should he find another? End of Section 61. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Section 62 of Marion Fay by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 19. My Marion. The blow came very suddenly at last. About the middle of September the spirit of Marion Fay flitted away from all its earthly joys and all its earthly troubles. Lord Hampstead saw her alive for the last time at that interview which was described a few pages back. Whenever he proposed to go down again to Pegwell Bay, some objection was made, either by the Quaker or by Mrs. Roden on the Quaker's behalf. The doctor, it was alleged, had declared that such visits were injurious to his patient, or perhaps it was that Marion had herself said that she was unable to bear the excitement. There was, no doubt, some truth in this, and Marion had seen that, though she herself could enjoy the boundless love which her lover tendered to her, telling herself that though it was only for a while, It was very sweet to have it so, yet for him these meetings were full of agony. But in addition to this there was, I think, a jealousy on the part of Zachary Fay as to his daughter. When there was still a question whether the young lord should be his son-in-law, he had been willing to give way and to subordinate himself, even though his girl were the one thing left to him in all the world. While there was an idea that she should be married, there had accompanied that idea a hope, almost an expectation, that she might live. But when it was brought home to him as a fact that her marriage was out of the question because her life was waning, then unconsciously there grew up in his heart a feeling that the young lord ought not to rob him of what was left. Had Marion insisted, he would have yielded. Had Mrs. Roden told him that it was cruel to separate them, he would have groaned and given way. As it was, he simply leaned to that view of the matter which gave him the greatest preponderance with his own child. It may be that she saw it too, and would not wound him by asking for her lover's presence. About the middle of September she died, having written to Hampstead that very day before her death. Her letters lately had become but a few words each, which Mrs. Roden would put into an envelope and send to their destination. He wrote daily, assuring her that he would not leave his home for a day in order that he might go up to her instantly when she would send for him. To the last she never gave up the idea of seeing him again, but at last the little light flickered out quicker than had been expected. Mrs. Roden was at Pegwell Bay when the end came, and to her fell the duty of making it known to Lord Hampstead. She went up to town immediately, leaving the Quaker in the desolate cottage, and sent down a note from Holloway to Hendon Hall. "I must see you as soon as possible. Shall I go to you, or will you come to me?" When she wrote the words she was sure that he would understand their purport, and yet it was easier to write so than to tell the cruel truth plainly. The note was sent down by a messenger, but Lord Hampstead in person was the answer. There was no need of any telling. When he stood before her dressed from head to foot in black, she took him by the two hands and looked into his face. "It is all over for her," he said. "The trouble and the anguish and the sense of long dull days to come. My Marion! How infinitely she has the best of it! How glad I ought to be that it is so!" "You must wait, Lord Hampstead," she said. "Pray, pray let me have no consolation. Waiting in the sense you mean there will be none. For the one relief which will finally come to me I must of course wait. Did she say any word that you would wish to tell me?" "Many, many." "Were they for my ears?" "What other words should she have spoken to me? They were prayers for your health." "My health needs not her prayers." "Prayers for your soul's health." "Such praying will be efficacious there, or would be were anything needed to make her fit for those angels among whom she has gone. For me they can do nothing, unless it be that in knowing how much she loved me I may strive to be as she was." "And for your happiness." "Psha!" he exclaimed. "You must let me do her commission, Lord Hampstead. I was to bid you remember that God in his goodness has ordained that the dead after a while shall be remembered only with a softened sorrow. I was to tell you that, as a man, you should give your thoughts to other things. It is not from myself, it is from her." She did not know. She did not understand. As regards good and evil she was, to my eyes, perfect. Perfect as she was in beauty, in grace, and feminine tenderness. But the character of others she had not learned to read. But I need not trouble you as to that, Mrs. Roden. You have been good to her as though you were her mother, and I will love you for it while I live." Then he was going away, but he turned again to ask some question as to the funeral. Might he do it? Mrs. Roden shook her head. "But I shall be there." To this she assented, but explained to him that Zachary Fay would admit of no interference with that which he considered to be his own privilege and his own duty. Lord Hampstead had driven himself over from Hendon Hall, and had driven fast. When he left Mrs. Roden's house, the groom was driving the dog cart up and down Paradise Row, waiting for his master. But the master walked on out of the Row, forgetting altogether the horse and the cart and the man, not knowing whither he was going. The blow had come, and though it had been fully expected, though he had known well that it was coming, it struck him now as hard, almost harder than if it had not been expected. It seemed to himself that he was unable to endure his sorrow now because he had been already weakened by such a load of sorrow. Because he had grieved so much, he could not now bear this further grief. As he walked on, he beat his hands about, unconscious that he was in the midst of men and women who were gazing at him in the streets. There was nothing left to him, nothing, nothing, nothing. He felt that if he could rid himself of his titles, rid himself of his wealth, rid himself of the very clothes upon his back, it would be better for him, so that he might not seem to himself to think that comfort could be found in externals. "Marion," he said, over and over again, in little whispered words, but loud enough for his own ears to hear the sound. And then he uttered phrases which were almost fantastic in their woe, but which declared what was and had been the condition of his mind towards her since she had become so inexpressibly dear to him. "My wife," he said, "my own one, mother of my children, my woman, my countess, my princess. They should have seen. They should have acknowledged. They should have known whom it was that I had brought among them. Of what nature should be the woman whom a man should set in a high place. I had made my choice, and then that it should come to this! There is no good to be done," he said again. "It all turns to ashes and dust. The low things of the world are those which prevail. Oh, Marion, that I could be with you, though it were to be nowhere, though the great story should have no pathetic ending, though the last long eternal chapter should be a blank, still to have wandered away with you would have been something." As soon as he reached his house he walked straight into the drawing room, and having carefully closed the door, he took the poker in his hand and held it clasped there as something precious. "It is the only thing of mine," he said, "that she has touched. Even then I swore to myself that this hearth should be her hearth, that here we would sit together and be one flesh and one bone." Then surreptitiously he took the bit of iron away with him and hid it among his treasures, to the subsequent dismay of the housemaid. There came to him a summons from the Quaker to the funeral, and on the day named, without saying a word to any one, he took the train and went down to Pegwell Bay. From the moment on which the messenger had come from Mrs. Roden, he had dressed himself in black, and now he made no difference in his garments. Poor Zachary said but little to him, but that little was very bitter. "It has been so with all of them," he said. "They have all been taken. The Lord cannot strike me again now." Of the highly born stranger's grief, or of the cause which brought him there, he had not a word to say, nor did Lord Hampstead speak of his own sorrow. "I sympathize and condole with you," he said to the old man. The Quaker shook his head, and after that there was silence between them till they parted. To the few others who were there, Lord Hampstead did not address himself, nor did they to him. From the grave, when the clod of earth had been thrown on it, he walked slowly away, without a sign on his face of that agony which was rending his heart. There was a carriage there to take him to the railway, but he only shook his head when he was invited to enter it. He walked off and wandered about for hours, till he thought that the graveyard would be deserted. Then he returned, and when he found himself alone he stood over the newly heaped up soil. "Marion," he said to himself over and over again, whispering as he stood there, "Marion, Marion, my wife, my woman." As he stood by the graveside, one came softly stealing up to him, and laid a hand upon his shoulder. He turned round quickly, and saw that it was the bereaved father. "Mr. Fay," he said, "we have both lost the only thing that either of us valued." "What is it to thee, who are young, and hardly knew her 12 months since?" "Months make no difference, I think." "But old age, my lord, and childishness, and solitude." "I too am alone." "She was my daughter, my own. Thou hadst seen a pretty face, and that was all. She had remained with me when those others died. Had thou not come—" "Did my coming kill her, Mr. Fay?" "I do not say that. Thou hast been good to her, and I would not say a hard word to thee." "I did think that nothing could have added to my sorrow." "No, my lord; no, no. She would have died. She was her dear mother's child, and she was doomed. Go away and be thankful that thou too hast not become the father of children born only to perish in your sight. I will not say an unkind word, but I would wish to have my girl's grave to myself." Upon this Lord Hampstead walked off, and went back to his own home, hardly knowing how he reached it. It was a month after this that he returned to the churchyard, and might have been seen sitting on the small stone slab which the Quaker had already caused to be laid over the grave. It was a fine October evening, and the sombre gloom of the hours was already darkening everything around. He had crept into the enclosure silently, almost slyly, so as to ensure himself that his presence should not be noted. And now, made confident by the coming darkness, he had seated himself on the stone. During the long hours that he sat there, no word was formed within his lips. But he surrendered himself entirely to the thoughts of what his life might have been had she been spared to him. He had come there for a purpose the very opposite of that, but how often does it come to pass that we are unable to drive our thoughts into that channel in which we wish them to flow? He had thought much of her last words, and was minded to attempt to do something as she would have had him do it, not that he might enjoy his life, but that he might make it useful. But as he sat there he could not think of the real future, not of the future as it might be made to take this or that form by his own efforts, but of the future as it would have been had she been with him, of the glorious, bright, beautiful future which her love, her goodness, her beauty, her tenderness would have illuminated. Till he had seen her his heart had never been struck. Ideas sufficiently pleasant in themselves, though tinged with a certain irony and sarcasm, had been frequent with him as to his future career. He would leave that building up of a future family of marquises, if future marquises there were to be, to one of those young darlings whose bringing up would manifestly fit them for the work. For himself he would perhaps philosophize, perhaps do something that might be of service, would indulge at any rate his own views as to humanity, but he would not burden himself with a countess and a nursery full of young lords and ladies. He had often said to Roden, had often said to Vivian, that her ladyship, his stepmother, need not trouble herself. He certainly would not be guilty of making either a countess or a marchioness. They of course had laughed at him, and had bid him bide his time. He had bided his time, as they had said, and Marion Fay had been the result. Yes, life would have been worth the having if Marion Fay had remained to him. It was thus he communed with himself as he sat there on the tomb. From the moment in which he had first seen her in Mrs. Roden's house he had felt that things were changed with him. There had come a vision before him which filled him full of delight. As he learned to know the tones of her voice and the motions of her limbs, and to succumb to the feminine charms with which she enveloped him, all the world was brightened up to his view. Here there was no pretence of special blood, no assumption of fantastic titles, no claim to superiority because of fathers and mothers who were in themselves by no means superior to their neighbours. And yet there had been all the grace, all the loveliness, all the tenderness, without which his senses would not have been captivated. He had never known his want, but he had in truth wanted one who should be at all points a lady, and yet not insist on a right to be so esteemed on the strength of inherited privileges. Chance, good fortune, Providence had sent her to him, or more probably the eternal fitness of things, as he had allowed himself to argue when things had fallen out so well to his liking. Then there had arisen difficulties which had seemed to him to be vain and absurd, though they would not allow themselves to be at once swept away. They had talked to him of his station and of hers, making that an obstacle which to him had been a strong argument in favour of her love. Against this he had done battle with the resolute purpose which a man has who is sure of his cause. He would have none of their sophistries, none of their fears, none of their old-fashioned absurdities. Did she love him? Was her heart to him as was his to her? That was the one question on which it must all depend. As he thought of it all, sitting there on the tombstone, he put out his arm as though to fold her form to his bosom, when he thought of the moment in which he became sure that it was so. There had been no doubt of the full flowing current of her love. Then he had aroused himself, and had shaken his mane like a lion, and had sworn aloud that this vain obstacle should be no obstacle, even though it was pleaded by herself. Nature had been strong enough within him to assure him that he would overcome the obstacle. And he had overcome it, or was overcoming it, when that other barrier gradually presented itself, and loomed day by day terribly large before his affrighted eyes. Even to that he would not yield, not only as regarded her, but himself also. Had there been no such barrier, the possession of Marion would have been to him an assurance of perfect bliss, which the prospect of far distant death would not have effected. When he began to perceive that her condition was not as that of other young women, he became aware of a great danger, of a danger to himself as well as to her, to himself rather than to her. This increased rather than diminished his desire for the possession. As the ardent writer will be more intent to take the fence when it looms before him large and difficult, so with him the resolution to make Marion his wife became the stronger when he knew that there were reasons of prudence, reasons of caution, reasons of worldly wisdom why he should not do so. It had become a religion to him that she should be his one. Then gradually her strength had become known to him, and slowly he was made aware that he must bow to her decision. All that he wanted in all the world he must not have. Not that the love which he craved was wanting, but because she knew that her own doom was fixed. She had bade him retrick his beams and take the light and the splendour of his sun elsewhere. The light and the splendour of his sun had all passed from him. She had absorbed them altogether. He, while he had been boasting to himself of his power and his manliness, in that he would certainly overcome all the barriers, had found himself to be weak as water in her hands. She, in her soft feminine tones, had told him what duty had required of her, and, as she had said, so she had done. Then he had stood on one side and had remained looking on till she had gone away and left him. She had never been his. It had not been allowed to him even to write his name as belonging also to her on the gravestone. But she had loved him. There was nothing in it all but this to which his mind could revert with any feeling of satisfaction. She had certainly loved him. If such love might be continued between a disembodied spirit and one still upon the earth, if there were any spirit capable of love after that divorce between the soul and the body, her love certainly would still be true to him. Most assuredly his should be true to her. Whatever he might do towards obeying her, in striving to form some manly purpose for his life, he would never ask another woman to be his wife. He would never look for another love. The black coat should be laid aside as soon as might be, so that the world around him should not have cause for remark, but the mourning should never be taken from his heart. Then, when the darkness of night had quite come upon him, he arose from his seat, and flinging himself on his knees, stretched his arms wildly across the grave. "Marion," he said, "Marion, oh Marion, will you hear me? Though gone from me, art thou not mine?" He looked up into the night, and there before his eyes was her figure, beautiful as ever, with all her loveliness of half-developed form, with her soft hair upon her shoulders, and her eyes beamed on him, and a heavenly smile came across her face, and her lips moved as though she would encourage him. My Marion, my wife! Very late that night the servants heard him as he opened the door and walked across the hall and made his way up to his own room. End of section 62. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Section 63 of Marion Fay by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 20. Mr. Greenwood's Last Battle. During the whole of that long summer nothing was absolutely arranged as to Roden and Lady Frances, though it was known to all London, and to a great many persons outside of London, that they were certainly to become man and wife. The summer was very long to Lord and Lady Trafford, because of the necessity incumbent on them of remaining through the last dregs of the season on account of Lady AMALDINA'S marriage. Had Lady AMALDINA thrown herself away on another Roden, the aunt would have, no doubt, gone to the country. But her niece had done her duty in life with so much propriety and success that it would have been indecent to desert her. Lady Kingsbury therefore remained in Park Lane, and was driven to endure frequently the sight of the Post Office clerk. For George Roden was admitted to the house, even though it was at last acknowledged that he must be George Roden and nothing more. And it was found also that he must be a Post Office clerk and nothing more. Lord Persiflage, on whom Lady Kingsbury chiefly depended for seeing that her own darlings should not be disgraced by being made brothers-in-law to anything so low as a clerk in the Post Office, was angry at last, and declared that it was impossible to help a man who would not help himself. It is no use trying to pick a man up who will lie in the gutter. It was thus he spoke of Roden in his anger, and then the Marchioness would wring her hands and abuse her stepdaughter. Lord Persiflage did think that something might be done for the young man, if the young man would only allow himself to be called a duke. But the young man would not allow it, and Lord Persiflage did not see what could be done. Nevertheless, there was a general idea abroad in the world that something would be done. Even the mysterious savour of high rank which attached itself to the young man would do something for him. It may be remembered that the Marquis himself, when first the fact had come to his ears that his daughter loved the young man, had been almost as ferociously angry as his wife. He had assented to the carrying of her away to the Saxon castle. He had frowned upon her. He had been a party to the expelling her from his own house. But gradually his heart had become softened towards her. In his illness he had repented of his harshness. He had not borne her continued absence easily, and had of late looked about for an excuse for accepting her lover. When the man was discovered to be a duke, though it was only an Italian duke, of course he accepted him. Now his wife told him daily that Roden was not a duke, because he would not accept his dukedom, and ought therefore again to be rejected. Lord Persiflage had declared that nothing could be done for him, and therefore he ought to be rejected. But the Marquis clung to his daughter. As the man was absolutely a duke, according to the laws of all the heralds, and all the courts, and all the tables of precedency and usages of peerage in Christendom, he could not degrade himself even by any motion of his own. He was the eldest and the legitimate son of the last Duca di Crinola, so the Marquis said, and as such was a fitting aspirant for the hand of the daughter of an English peer. "But he hasn't got a shilling," said Lady Kingsbury, weeping. The Marquis felt that it was within his own power to produce some remedy for this evil, but he did not care to say as much to his wife, who was tender on that point in regard to the interest of her 3 darlings. Roden continued his visits to Park Lane very frequently all through the summer, and had already arranged for an autumn visit to Castle Hautboy, in spite of that angry word spoken by Lord Persiflage. Everybody knew he was to marry Lady Frances. But when the season was over, and all the world had flitted from London, nothing was settled. Lady Kingsbury was of course very unhappy during all this time, but there was a source of misery deeper, more pressing, more crushing than even the Post Office clerk. Mr. Greenwood, the late chaplain, had during his last interview with the Marquis expressed some noble sentiments. He would betray nothing that had been said to him in confidence. He would do nothing that could annoy the Marchioness, because the Marchioness was a lady, and as such entitled to all courtesy from him as a gentleman. There were grounds, no doubt, on which he could found a claim, but he would not insist on them, as his doing so would be distasteful to her ladyship. He felt that he was being ill-treated, almost robbed, but he would put up with that rather than say a word which would come against his own conscience as a gentleman. With these high assurances he took his leave of the Marquis as though he intended to put up with the beggarly stipend of £200 a year which the Marquis had promised him. Perhaps that had been his intention, but before 2 days were over he had remembered that, though it might be base to tell her ladyship's secrets, the penny post was still open to him. It certainly was the case that Lady Kingsbury had spoken to him with strong hopes of the death of the heir to the title. Mr. Greenwood, in discussing the matter with himself, went beyond that, and declared to himself that she had done so with expectation as well as hope. Fearful words had been said, so he assured himself. He thanked his God that nothing had come of it. Only for him, something, he assured himself, would have come of it. The whisperings in that upstairs sitting room at Trafford had been dreadful. He had divulged nothing. He had held his tongue, like a gentleman. But ought he not to be paid for holding his tongue? There are so many who act honestly from noble motives, and then feel that their honesty should be rewarded by all those gains which dishonesty might have procured for them. About a fortnight after the visit which Mr. Greenwood made to the Marquis, he did write a letter to the Marchioness.
"I am not anxious," he said, "to do more than remind your ladyship of those peculiarly confidential discussions which took place between yourself and me at Trafford during the last winter. But I think you will acknowledge that they were of a nature to make me feel that I should not be discarded like an old glove. If you would tell his lordship that something should be done for me, something would be done."
Her ladyship, when she received this, was very much frightened. She remembered the expressions she had allowed herself to use, and did say a hesitating, halting word to her husband, suggesting that Mr. Greenwood's pension should be increased. The Marquis turned upon her in anger. "Did you ever promise him anything?" he asked. No, she had promised him nothing. "I am giving him more than he deserves, and will do no more," said the Marquis. There was something in his voice which forbade her to speak another word. Mr. Greenwood's letter having remained for 10 days without an answer, there came another.
"I cannot but think that you will acknowledge my right to expect an answer," he said, "considering the many years through which I have enjoyed the privilege of your ladyship's friendship, and the very confidential terms on which we have been used to discuss matters of the highest interest to us both."
The "matters" had no doubt been the probability of the accession to the title of her own son through the demise of his elder brother. She understood now all her own folly, and something of her own wickedness. To this second appeal she wrote a short answer, having laid awake over it one entire night. "Dear Mr. Greenwood, I have spoken to the Marquis, and he will do nothing. Yours truly, C. Kingsbury." This she did without saying a word to her husband. Then, after the interval of a few days, there came a third letter.
"My dear Lady Kingsbury, I cannot allow myself to think that this should be the end of it all, after so many years of social intimacy and confidential intercourse. Can you yourself imagine the condition of a gentleman of my age, reduced, after a life of ease and comfort, to exist on a miserable pension of £200 a year? It simply means death, death. Have I not a right to expect something better after the devotion of a life? Who has known as well as I the stumbling blocks to your ladyship's ambition which have been found in the existences of Lord Hampstead and Lady Frances Trafford? I have sympathized with you, no doubt, partly because of their peculiarities, partly from sincere affection for your ladyship. It cannot surely be that your ladyship should now treat me as an enemy because I could do no more than sympathize. Dig I cannot. To beg I am ashamed. You will hardly wish that I should perish from want. I have not as yet been driven to open out my sad case to any one but yourself. Do not force me to it, for the sake of those darling children for whose welfare I have ever been so anxious. Believe me to be your ladyship's most devoted and faithful friend, Thomas Greenwood.
This epistle so frightened her that she began to consider how she might best collect together a sufficient sum of money to satisfy the man. She did succeed in sending him a note for £50, but this he was too wary to take. He returned it, saying that he could not, though steeped in poverty, accept chance eleemosynary aid. What he required, and had, he thought, a right to ask, was an increase to the fixed stipend allowed him. He must, he thought, again force himself upon the presence of the Marquis, and explain the nature of the demand more explicitly. Upon this Lady Kingsbury showed all the letters to her husband. "What does he mean by stumbling blocks?" asked the Marquis in his wrath. Then there was a scene which was sad enough. She had to confess that she had spoken very freely to the chaplain respecting her stepchildren.
Freely? What does freely mean? Do you want them out of the way?
What a question for a husband to have to ask his wife! But she had a door by which she could partly escape. It was not that she had wanted them out of the way, but that she had been so horrified by what she had thought to be their very improper ideas as to their own rank of life. Those marriages which they had intended had caused her to speak as she had done to the chaplain. When alone at Trafford she had no doubt opened her mind to the clergyman. She rested a great deal on the undoubted fact that Mr. Greenwood was a clergyman. Hampstead and Fanny had been stumbling blocks to her ambition, because she had desired to see them married properly into proper families. She probably thought she was telling the truth as she said all this. It was at any rate accepted as truth, and she was condoned. As to Hampstead, it was known by this time that that marriage could never take place. And as to Lady Frances, the Marchioness was driven, in her present misery, to confess that as the Duca was in truth a Duca, his family must be held to be proper. But the Marquis sent for Mr. Cumming, his London solicitor, and put all the letters into his hand, with such explanation as he thought necessary to give. Mr. Cumming at first recommended that the pension should be altogether stopped, but to this the Marquis did not consent. "It would not suit me that he should starve," said the Marquis; "but if he continues to write to her ladyship, something must be done." "Threatening letters to extort money," said the lawyer, confidently. "I can have him before a magistrate to morrow, my lord, if it be thought well." It was, however, felt to be expedient that Mr. Cumming should in the first case send for Mr. Greenwood, and explain to that gentleman the nature of the law. Mr. Cumming no doubt felt himself that it would be well that Mr. Greenwood should not starve, and well also that application should not be made to the magistrate, unless as a last resort. He too asked himself what was meant by stumbling blocks. Mr. Greenwood was a greedy rascal, descending to the lowest depth of villainy with the view of making money out of the fears of a silly woman. But the silly woman, the lawyer thought, must have been almost worse than silly. It seemed natural to Mr. Cumming that a stepmother should be anxious for the worldly welfare of her own children. Not unnatural, perhaps, that she should be so anxious as to have a feeling at her heart amounting almost to a wish that chance should remove the obstacle. Chance, as Mr. Cumming was aware, could in such a case mean only death. Mr. Cumming, when he put this in plain terms to himself, felt it to be very horrid. But there might be a doubt whether such a feeling would be criminal, if backed up by no deed and expressed by no word. But here it seemed that words had been spoken. Mr. Greenwood had probably invented that particular phrase, but would hardly have invented it unless something had been said to justify it. It was his business, however, to crush Mr. Greenwood, and not to expose her ladyship. He wrote a very civil note to Mr. Greenwood. Would Mr. Greenwood do him the kindness to call in Bedford Row at such or such an hour, or indeed at any other hour that might suit him? Mr. Greenwood, thinking much of it, and resolving in his mind that any increase to his pension might probably be made through Mr. Cumming, did as he was bid, and waited upon the lawyer. Mr. Cumming, when the clergyman was shown in, was seated with the letters before him, the various letters which Mr. Greenwood had written to Lady Kingsbury, folded out one over another, so that the visitor's eye might see them and feel their presence, but he did not intend to use them unless of necessity. "Mr. Greenwood," he said, "I learn that you are discontented with the amount of a retiring allowance which the Marquis of Kingsbury has made you on leaving his service."
"I am, Mr. Cumming; certainly I am. £200 a year is not—"
"Let us call it 300, Mr. Greenwood."
Well, yes, Lord Hampstead did say something.
And has paid something. Let us call it £300. Not that the amount matters. The Marquis and Lord Hampstead are determined not to increase it.
Determined?
Quite determined that under no circumstances will they increase it. They may find it necessary to stop it.
Is this a threat?
Certainly it is a threat, as far as it goes. There is another threat which I may have to make for the sake of coercing you, but I do not wish to use it if I can do without it.
Her ladyship knows that I am ill-treated in this matter. She sent me £50, and I returned it. It was not in that way that I wished to be paid for my services.
It was well for you that you did. But for that I could not certainly have asked you to come and see me here.
You could not?
No, I could not. You will probably understand what I mean. Here Mr. Cumming laid his hands upon the letters, but made no other allusion to them. A very few words more will, I think, settle all that there is to be arranged between us. The Marquis, from certain reasons of humanity, with which I for one hardly sympathize in this case, is most unwilling to stop or even to lessen the ample pension which is paid to you.
Ample? After a whole lifetime?
But he will do so if you write any further letters to any member of his family.
That is tyranny, Mr. Cumming.
Very well. Then is the Marquis a tyrant? But he will go further than that in his tyranny. If it be necessary to defend either himself or any of his family from further annoyance, he will do so by criminal proceedings. You are probably aware that the doing this would be very disagreeable to the Marquis. Undoubtedly it would. To such a man as Lord Kingsbury, it is a great trouble to have his own name, or worse, that of others of his family, brought into a police court. But if necessary, it will be done. I do not ask you for any assurance, Mr. Greenwood, because it may be well that you should take a little time to think of it. But unless you are willing to lose your income, and to be taken before a police magistrate for endeavouring to extort money by threatening letters, you had better hold your hand.
I have never threatened.
Good morning, Mr. Greenwood.
Mr. Cumming, I have threatened no one.
Good morning, Mr. Greenwood. Then the discarded chaplain took his leave, failing to find the words with which he could satisfactorily express his sense of the injury which had been done him. Before that day was over he had made up his mind to take his £300 a year and be silent. The Marquis, he now found, was not so infirm as he had thought, nor the Marchioness quite so full of fears. He must give it up and take his pittance. But in doing so he continued to assure himself that he was greatly injured, and did not cease to accuse Lord Kingsbury of sordid parsimony in refusing to reward adequately one whose services to the family had been so faithful and long enduring. It may, however, be understood that in the midst of troubles such as these, Lady Kingsbury did not pass a pleasant summer. End of section 63. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina. Section 64 of Marion Fay by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Volume 3, Chapter 21. The Registrar of State Records. Although Lord Persiflage had seemed to be very angry with the recusant Duke, and had made that uncivil speech about the gutter, still he was quite willing that George Roden should be asked down to Castle Hautboy. "Of course we must do something for him," he said to his wife, "but I hate unscrupulous men. I don't blame him at all for making such a girl as Fanny fall in love with him. If I were a Post Office clerk I'd do the same if I could." "Not you. You wouldn't have given yourself the trouble." "But when I had done it, I wouldn't have given her friends more trouble than was necessary. I should have known that they would have had to drag me up somewhere. I should have looked for that. But I shouldn't have made myself difficult when chance gave a helping hand. Why shouldn't he have taken his title?" "Of course we all wish he would." "Fanny is as bad as he is. She has caught some of Hampstead's levelling ideas, and encourages the young man. It was all Kingsbury's fault from the first. He began the world wrong, and now he cannot get himself right again. A Radical aristocrat is a contradiction in terms. It is very well that there should be Radicals. It would be a stupid do-nothing world without them. But a man can't be oil and vinegar at the same time." This was the expression made by Lord Persiflage of his general ideas on politics in reference to George Roden and his connection with the Trafford family. But not the less was George Roden asked down to Castle Hautboy. Lady Frances was not to be thrown over because she had made a fool of herself, nor was George Roden to be left out in the cold, belonging as he did now to Lady Frances. Lord Persiflage never approved very much of anybody, but he never threw anybody over. It was soon after the funeral of Marion Fay that Roden went down to Cumberland. During the last 2 months of Marion's illness Hampstead and Roden had been very often together. Not that they had lived together, as Hampstead had declared himself unable to bear continued society. His hours had been passed alone, but there had not been many days in which the friends had not seen each other for a few minutes. It had become a habit with Hampstead to ride over to Paradise Row when Roden had returned from the office. At first Mrs. Roden also had been there, but latterly she had spent her time altogether at Pegwell Bay. Nevertheless Lord Hampstead would come, and would say a few words, and would then ride home again. When all was over at Pegwell Bay, when the funeral was at hand, and during the few days of absolutely prostrating grief which followed it, nothing was seen of him. But on the evening before his friend's journey down to Castle Hautboy he again appeared in the Row. On this occasion he walked over, and his friend returned with him a part of the way. "You must do something with yourself," Roden said to him. "I see no need of doing anything special. How many men do nothing with themselves?" "Men either work or play." "I do not think I shall play much." "Not for a time, certainly. You used to play, but I can imagine that the power of doing so will have deserted you." "I shan't hunt, if you mean that." "I do not mean that at all," said Roden, "but that you should do something. There must be some occupation, or life will be insupportable." "It is insupportable," said the young man, looking away, so that his countenance should not be seen. "But it must be supported. Let the load be ever so heavy, it must be carried. You would not destroy yourself?" "No," said the other slowly. "No, I would not do that, if any one would do it for me." "No one will do it for you. Not to have some plan of active life, some defined labour by which the weariness of the time may be conquered, would be a weakness and a cowardice next door to that of suicide." "Roden," said the lord, "your severity is brutal." "The question is whether it be true. You shall call it what you like, or call me what you like, but can you contradict what I say? Do you not feel that it is your duty as a man to apply what intellect you have, and what strength, to some purpose?" Then by degrees Lord Hampstead did explain the purpose he had before him. He intended to have a yacht built, and start alone, and cruise about the face of the world. He would take books with him, and study the peoples and the countries which he visited. "Alone?" asked Roden. "Yes, alone, as far as a man may be alone, with a crew and a captain around him. I shall make acquaintances as I go, and shall be able to bear them as such. They will know nothing of my secret wound. Had I you with me, you and my sister, let us suppose, or Vivian, or any one from here who had known me, I could not even struggle to raise my head." "It would wear off." "I will go alone, and if occasion offers I will make fresh acquaintances. I will begin another life which shall have no connection with the old one, except that which will be continued by the thread of my own memory. No one shall be near me who may even think of her name, when my own ways and manners are called in question." He went on to explain that he would set himself to work at once. The ship must be built, and the crew collected, and the stores prepared. He thought that in this way he might find employment for himself till the spring. In the spring, if all was ready, he would start. Till that time came he would live at Hendon Hall, still alone. He so far relented, however, as to say that if his sister was married before he began his wanderings, he would be present at her marriage. Early in the course of the evening he had explained to Roden that his father and he had conjointly arranged to give Lady Frances £40,000 on her wedding. "Can that be necessary?" asked Roden. "You must live, and as you have gone into a nest with the drones, you must live in some sort as the drones do." "I hope I shall never be a drone." "You cannot touch pitch and not be defiled. You'll be expected to wear gloves and drink fine wine, or at any rate to give it to your friends. Your wife will have to ride in a coach. If she don't, people will point at her and think she's a pauper, because she has a handle to her name. They talk of the upper 10,000. It is as hard to get out from among them as it is to get in among them. Though you have been wonderfully stout about the Italian title, you'll find that it will stick to you." Then it was explained that the money which was to be given would in no wise interfere with the "darlings." Whatever was to be added to the fortune which would naturally have belonged to Lady Frances would not come from her father, but from her brother. When Roden arrived at Castle Hautboy, Lord Persiflage was there, though he remained but for a day. He was due to be with the Queen for a month, a duty which was evidently much to his taste, though he affected to frown over it as a hardship. "I am sorry, Roden," he said, "that I should be obliged to leave you and everybody else, but a Government hack, you know, has to be a Government hack." This was rather strong from a Secretary of State to a clerk in the Post Office, but Roden had to let it pass lest he should give an opening to some remark on his own repudiated rank. "I shall be back before you are gone, I hope, and then perhaps we may arrange something." The only thing that Roden wished to arrange was a day for his own wedding, as to which, as far as he knew, Lord Persiflage could have nothing to say. "I don't think you ought to be sorry," Lady Frances said to her lover, as they were wandering about on the mountains. He had endeavoured to explain to her that this large income which was now promised to him rather impeded than assisted the scheme of life which he had suggested to himself. "Not sorry, but disappointed, if you know the difference." "Not exactly." "I had wanted to feel that I should earn my wife's bread." "So you shall. If a man works honestly for his living, I don't think he need inquire too curiously what proportion of it may come from his own labour or from some other source. If I had had nothing, we should have done very well without the coach, as poor Hampstead calls it. But if the coach is there, I don't see why we shouldn't ride in it." "I should like to earn the coach too," said Roden. "This, sir, will be a lesson serviceable in teaching you that you are not to be allowed to have your own way in everything." An additional leave of absence for a month had been accorded to Roden. He had already been absent during a considerable time in the spring of the year, and in the ordinary course of events would not have been entitled to this prolonged indulgence. But there were reasons deemed to be sufficient. He was going to meet a cabinet minister. He was engaged to marry the daughter of a marquis. And it was known that he was not simply George Roden, but in truth the Duca di Crinola. He had suffered some qualms of conscience as to the favour to be thus shown him, but had quieted them by the idea that when a man is in love something special ought to be done for him. He remained, therefore, till the Foreign Secretary returned from his royal service, and had by that time fixed the period of his marriage. It was to take place in the cold, comfortless month of March. It would be a great thing, he had said, to have Hampstead present at it, and it was Hampstead's intention to start on his long travels early in April. "I don't see why people shouldn't be married in cold weather as well as in hot," said Vivian. "Brides need not go about always in muslin." When Lord Persiflage returned to Castle Hautboy, he had his plan ready arranged for relieving his future half-nephew-in-law, if there be such a relationship, from the ignominy of the Post Office. "I have Her Majesty's permission," he said to Roden, "to offer you the position of Registrar of State Records to the Foreign Office." "Registrar of State Records to the Foreign Office?" "1,500 a year," said his lordship, going off at once to this one point of true vital importance. "I am bound to say that I think I could have done better for you had you consented to bear the title, which is as completely your own as is that mine by which I am called. Don't let us go back to that, my lord." "Oh no, certainly not. Only this, if you could be brought to think better of it, if Fanny could be induced to make you think better of it, the office now offered to you would, I think, be more comfortable to you." "How so?" "I can hardly explain, but it would. There is no reason on earth why it should not be held by an Italian. We had an Italian for many years librarian at the museum, and as an Italian you would of course be entitled to call yourself by your hereditary title." "I shall never be other than an Englishman." "Very well. One man may lead a horse to water, but 1,000 cannot make him drink. I only tell you what would be the case. The title would no doubt give a prestige to the new office. It is exactly that kind of work which would fall readily into the hands of a foreigner of high rank. One cannot explain these things, but it is so. The £1,500 a year would more probably become £2,000 if you submitted to be called by your own proper name." Everybody knew that Lord Persiflage understood the civil service of his country perfectly. He was a man who never worked very hard himself, or expected those under him to do so, but he liked common sense and hated scruples, and he considered it to be a man's duty to take care of himself first of all, and then perhaps afterwards of the service. Neither did Roden nor did Lady Frances give way a bit the more for this. They were persistent in clinging to their old, comparatively humble English name. Lady Frances would be Lady Frances to the end, but she would be no more than Lady Frances Roden. And George Roden would be George Roden, whether a clerk in the Post Office or Registrar of State Records to the Foreign Office. So much the next new bride declared with great energy to the last new bride, who had just returned from her short wedding tour, having been hurried home so that her husband might be able to lay the first stone of the new bridge to be built over the Menai Straits. Lady Llwddythlw, with all the composed manners of a steady matron, was at Castle Hautboy, and used all her powers of persuasion. "Never mind, my dear, what he says," Lady Llwddythlw urged. "What you should think of is what will be good for him. He would be somebody, almost as good as an Under Secretary of State with a title. He would get to be considered among the big official swells. There is so much in a name. Of course you've got your rank, but you ought to insist on it for his sake." Lady Frances did not give way in the least, nor did any one venture to call the Duca by his title, formally or openly. But, as Lord Hampstead had said, it stuck to him. The women, when they were alone with him, would call him Duca, joking with him, and it was out of the question that he should be angry with them for their jokes. He became aware that behind his back he was always spoken of as the Duke, and that this was not done with any idea of laughing at him. The people around him believed that he was a duke, and ought to be called a duke. Of course it was in joke that Lady Llwddythlw always called Lady Frances Duchessina when they were together, because Lady Frances had certainly not as yet acquired her right to the name. But it all tended to the same point. He became aware that the very servants around him understood it. They did not call him Your Grace or My Lord, or make spoken allusion to his rank, but they looked it. All that obsequiousness due to an hereditary nobleman, which is dear to the domestic heart, was paid to him. He found himself called upon by Lady Persiflage to go into the dining room out of his proper place. There was a fair excuse for this while the party was small and confined to few beyond the family, as it was expected that the two declared lovers should sit together. But when this had been done with a larger party, he expostulated with his hostess. "My dear Mr. Roden," she said, "I suppose I must call you so?" "It's my name at any rate." "There are certain points on which, as far as I can see, a man may be allowed to have his way, and certain points on which he may not." "As to his own name?" "Yes; on the matter of your name. I do not see my way how to get the better of you just at present, though on account of my near connection with Fanny I am very anxious to do so. But as to the fact of your rank, there it is. Whenever I see you, and I hope I shall see you very often, I shall always suppose that I see an Italian nobleman of the first class, and shall treat you so." He shrugged his shoulders, feeling that he had nothing else to do. "If I were to find myself in the society of some man calling himself by a title to which I knew that he had no right, I should probably call him by no name. But I should be very careful not to treat him as a nobleman, knowing that he had no right to be so treated. What can I do in your case but just reverse the position?" He never went back to the Post Office, of course. What should a Registrar of State Records to the Foreign Office do in so humble an establishment? He never went back for the purposes of work. He called to bid farewell to Sir Boreas, Mr. Jerningham, Crocker, and others with whom he had served. "I did not think we should see much more of you," said Sir Boreas, laughing. "I intended to live and die with you," said Roden. "We don't have dukes, or at any rate we don't keep them. Like to like is a motto which I always find true. When I heard that you were living with a young lord, and were going to marry the daughter of a marquis, and had a title of your own which you could use as soon as you pleased, I knew that I should lose you." Then he added in a little whisper, "You couldn't get Crocker made a duke, could you, or a Registrar of Records?" Mr. Jerningham was full of smiles and bows, pervaded thoroughly by a feeling that he was bidding farewell to an august nobleman, though for negative reasons he was not to be allowed to gratify his tongue by naming the august name. Crocker was a little shy, but he plucked up his courage at last.
"I shall always know what I know, you know," he said,
as he shook hands with the friend to whom he had been so much attached. Bobbin and Geraghty made no allusions to the title, but they too, as they were severally greeted, were evidently under the influence of the nobility of their late brother clerk. The marriage was duly solemnized when March came in the parish church of Trafford. There was nothing grand, no even distant imitation of Lady Amaldina's glorious cavalcade. Hampstead did come down, and endeavoured for the occasion to fit himself for the joy of the day. His ship was ready for him, and he intended to start now in a week or two. As it happened that the House was not sitting, Lord Llwddythlw, at the instigation of his wife, was present. "One good turn deserves another," Lady Llwddythlw had said to him. And the darlings were there in all their glory, loud, beautiful, and unruly. Lady Kingsbury was of course present, but was too much in abeyance to be able to arouse even a sign of displeasure. Since that reference to the stumbling blocks had reached her husband, and since those fears with which Mr. Greenwood had filled her, she had been awed into quiescence. The bridegroom was of course married under the simple name of George Roden, and we must part with him under that name. But it is the belief of the present chronicler that the aristocratic element will prevail, and that the time will come soon in which the Registrar of State Records to the Foreign Office will be known in the purlieus of Downing Street as the Duca di Crinola. End of Section 64. End of Marion Fay, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.